Hey guys, tonight we take a step back in time into the murky and often grimy world of medieval hygiene. Imagine walking through the narrow, cobblestone streets of a bustling medieval town. The air is thick with the smell of livestock, food cooking in the open-air kitchens, and, well, a lot of people who haven't had the luxury of a proper bath in a while. Now, before you start feeling all superior in your modern soap-scented world. Keep in mind that back then, hygiene wasn't really something people worried about too much, unless you count the occasional ritualistic bath. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this journey. Given the complete lack of deodorant, toothpaste, or hand sanitizer, you're stepping into a world where the people around you are no strangers to dirt, sweat, and disease. You'd think hygiene would have been a priority, but sadly, it wasn't. The medieval world, particularly in the early periods, didn't have a lot of knowledge about germs or bacteria, and definitely not about sanitation like we do today. In fact, if you think about medieval hygiene practices, you're probably picturing a world that was both fascinating and revolting. Picture this. The average person didn't bathe regularly, didn't have toothpaste or toothbrushes, and didn't even really wash their hands with soap. Instead, hygiene, or the lack of it, was just a normal part of daily life. The smell of unwashed bodies, livestock, and the general lack of cleanliness was simply part of the landscape. What's even more mind-boggling is how such practices were so tightly linked to survival, health, and even politics. Poor hygiene often had devastating consequences for the people of the time, contributing to widespread illnesses that claimed thousands of lives. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of medieval hygiene and see how the lack of bathing, dirty teeth, and general filth impacted daily life. It's like a history lesson wrapped in an unpleasant scent that lingers in the air long after it's been told. As you move deeper into the medieval town, the scent grows stronger, earthy, unrefined, and a bit overwhelming. Imagine you've been walking for hours, your feet growing tired on the uneven cobblestones. The air smells of wet hay, animal manure, and human sweat, mixed in with the faintest hint of something burning in a hearth. It's not that the people here didn't want to smell better. They just didn't know how. Sure, there were occasional baths, but hygiene was a luxury few could afford. Back in the day, a bath wasn't a regular part of your routine. It was more of a special event, almost a social activity, and you were lucky if you got one in a year. Let's break down what bathing was like in this world. Picture yourself in a large, wooden tub that's been filled with water heated by a fire. You've probably seen a version of this in medieval films, where everyone gathers around a big wooden tub for a communal wash. For some, this might be one of the few times they get any kind of bath, and it's typically a public affair. But don't expect luxurious bubbles or even soap. Soap as we know it today wasn't even a thing back then. And the water wasn't changed after every person's turn. Now, imagine sharing the same bathwater with a bunch of other people. By the end of it, the water would be so murky that you couldn't see your own toes, and you'd be left wondering whether the grime you're feeling on your skin is from you or from the person who went before. Historians still argue whether baths were seen as a necessary form of cleanliness or merely a social event in medieval times. Some say that bathing was believed to open the pores, allowing for both physical and spiritual healing. Others suggest that the idea of frequent bathing was discouraged by the church, as it was linked to indulgence and sensual pleasure. That's right. Bathing, in many places, was not just about hygiene, It was about moral standing, too. In fact, the church often criticized public baths, linking them to immoral behavior and even disease. But regardless of the debate, one thing's clear: bathing wasn't something people did every day. In addition to these occasional baths, the medieval world had a rather peculiar approach to washing. Instead of soap, many people used a mixture of water, ash, and even animal fats to cleanse their bodies. The idea was to scrub away dirt and oil, but the results were less than stellar, leaving you feeling less refreshed and more like you'd just smeared lard on your skin. But hey, at least they tried, right? Now, let's talk about the other aspects of hygiene that went hand in hand with bathing, or rather, the lack thereof. As you walk deeper into this medieval town, you'll notice the other signs of hygiene, or more accurately, the lack of it. The people here are, for the most part, not terribly concerned with body odor. The idea of deodorant, as we know it today, didn't exist, and neither did regular washing of clothing. Clothes were often worn for long periods before being cleaned. If they were cleaned at all, it wasn't uncommon for someone to wear the same clothes for weeks at a time, and washing them, that was reserved for special occasions, not part of regular life. To make matters worse, laundering techniques weren't exactly cutting edge. People would wash their clothes in nearby streams or public baths, sometimes with a little bit of soap, but most often with just plain water. The results were far from sparkling clean. Now, think about this. People in medieval times didn't even know about germs. They didn't have the concept of bacteria and viruses, so they didn't realize that their unwashed clothes were spreading disease. In fact, many diseases that plagued medieval Europe, like the plague, were spread in part due to unsanitary living conditions. And it wasn't just the unwashed bodies and clothes. The very living conditions were far from clean. Animal waste was often found in the streets, and public latrines were more like open pits, shared by dozens of people. There were no modern plumbing systems, and the smell of urine and excrement was often so overpowering that it was just a part of the air you breathed. But don't be fooled. This wasn't a sign of laziness or lack of effort. In medieval times, people did try to maintain some level of cleanliness, even though they didn't have the tools or knowledge that we have today. For instance, some people used a variety of herbs and spices to cover up bad smells. Lavender, rosemary, and sage were common choices, used both in baths and as personal fragrances to ward off unpleasant odors. They believed that these herbs had medicinal properties, and using them might keep the body clean or even ward off disease. But while these herbs could mask the scent of sweat, they didn't do much for the underlying hygiene issues. Historians still debate whether medieval people had a deep understanding of hygiene and just lacked the tools to maintain it, or if they simply had a completely different concept of cleanliness altogether. Some believe that hygiene wasn't truly a priority for the medieval population until later in history, while others argue that there was a cultural shift away from public cleanliness due to the fear of disease and the church's stance on the dangers of indulgence. As you continue to stroll through the medieval streets, it's impossible to ignore the overwhelming presence of the church in daily life. This is where you begin to notice how much religious beliefs influenced hygiene, or, rather, the lack of it. The church's influence over personal hygiene and bodily care is a topic that scholars still debate today. For much of the medieval period, the church viewed bathing with suspicion. While it wasn't outright banned, it was seen as something that could lead to temptation and immoral behavior. After all, the human body was considered sinful, and the idea of excessive cleansing seemed to contradict the notion of accepting one's natural state. Medieval Christians believed that the body should be cleansed by spiritual means rather than through physical ones. In fact, some religious figures of the time even believed that frequent bathing could be harmful to the soul, as it was seen as a form of self-indulgence. So, while you're in this medieval town, you can imagine how people, especially those who were more devout, were likely discouraged from engaging in the kind of regular personal hygiene routines we consider normal today. Instead, they believed that prayer, fasting, and penance were the best ways to cleanse oneself, both spiritually and physically. On the other hand, the Church didn't completely dismiss hygiene. In fact, it played a role in ensuring some measure of cleanliness within monasteries. Monasteries were often the only places where proper bathing facilities existed, and they were equipped with basic baths and washing facilities, as monks were expected to live relatively clean lives. These were the exceptions, though, and outside of monasteries, the average person's access to clean water and bathing facilities was rare. You can almost picture the scene as you walk through the streets, in the homes of peasants. Water was often gathered from nearby wells or rivers, but it was never enough to fill the needs of the body or the household. In most places, you'd be lucky to find a basin for washing, let alone a proper bath. Interestingly, medieval medical advice was often more focused on the internal aspects of hygiene, such as balancing the humors. Physicians and medical practitioners believed that a person's internal health was just as important, if not more so, than the cleanliness of their body. Bathing was, at best, a secondary concern. It's strange to think about, but it was common for people to focus on purging the body with medicinal remedies rather than cleaning it through water. So, while medieval people weren't the most diligent about washing, they had a whole different set of priorities when it came to their health. They believed that sickness was caused by imbalances in the body, not necessarily from a lack of hygiene. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practices were more focused on internal health as a way to avoid the potential risks of bathing, or if it was simply a matter of religious and social norms. Some suggest that the fear of bathing in public baths, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire, led to a decline in the practice. Others believe that the medical focus on humors and internal remedies made people less concerned with external cleanliness altogether. As the evening wears on, you begin to notice how medieval hygiene was not only about cleanliness, but also about social status. The wealthier members of society had access to luxuries like private baths, perfumes, and even scented oils, while the lower classes had to make do with the most basic means of keeping clean or not. The divide between the haves and the have-nots was just as stark when it came to hygiene. If you were fortunate enough to be born into a noble family, you might have had a servant who could help you bathe, or even a lavish bathhouse built on your estate. But for most people, a good wash was a rare luxury. For the wealthy, bathing and cleanliness were tied to status. Nobles were more likely to keep personal hygiene rituals that included a certain level of bathing, often for the sake of appearance and health. A nobleman or woman would have access to perfumed oils and soaps that were imported from faraway lands. They may have even had a servant to help them with the process, as personal servants played an important role in upholding the standards of cleanliness that their masters could afford. You can imagine the lavish bathhouses where the wealthy would gather, not just to clean themselves, but to engage in gossip, politics, and business. For the nobility, the art of hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness, It was about maintaining a polished image. But outside the halls of the rich, the lower classes lived in a very different reality. For peasants, hygiene was often more about survival than aesthetics. The idea of a warm bath was a rare luxury, and soap was not something that everyone had access to. Many peasants would only bathe in the summer when water was more plentiful and the weather warmer. In winter, it was common for people to go without a bath for months at a time. You can almost feel the contrast as you walk through the village, where the air smells less of perfumes and oils and more of sweat, earth, and the smoky remnants of firewood. In these rough conditions, personal hygiene was far from a priority. Medieval people also believed that washing too often could be harmful, especially in colder climates. This fear was tied to the belief that the body's natural warmth was being stripped away by too much exposure to water. Bathing was thought to make the body too vulnerable to disease and illness, something that was particularly concerning in an era when disease outbreaks were frequent and often deadly. So, for many, staying warm and keeping covered up was a form of protection from the outside world's threats. The fact that bathing was seen with suspicion made it more of an occasional activity than a regular part of life. Historians still argue whether the reluctance to bathe in the medieval period was based more on medical beliefs or social norms. Some suggest that it was rooted in the fear of disease, while others point to the strong influence of religious teachings that emphasized cleanliness as a purely internal matter. There is also evidence that hygiene standards varied depending on the region. Bathing was more common in the southern parts of Europe, where the weather allowed for more frequent washing, whereas Northern Europe had a more restricted approach. Whatever the reason, medieval hygiene was a far cry from what we would consider clean by modern standards. As the day drifts further into the evening, your mind lingers on the oddity of medieval hygiene, particularly the ways people coped with their lack of modern conveniences, even something as simple as brushing your teeth. Well, it wasn't quite so simple back then. You stand in the tavern, watching as people sip their ale, and you start to wonder how they kept their mouths clean without the toothpaste and toothbrushes we rely on today. The truth is, medieval people didn't have the luxury of minty toothpaste and modern dental hygiene tools. Instead, they had to rely on much more rudimentary methods to clean their teeth. One of the more common methods was the use of a chewing stick, a small, thin twig that was chewed at one end to create a brush-like effect. These sticks, often made from aromatic wood like birch or hazel, were known to help clean the teeth and freshen the breath. Though not in the way we would expect today. It's hard to imagine, but in the absence of toothbrushes, medieval people had to make do with what nature provided. They didn't have fluoride or the specialized cleaning agents we use now. So their oral hygiene was much more about scraping off the grime rather than making their teeth shine. You can almost see them, standing around the fire, their mouths busy with chewing sticks, getting their daily dose of dental care the best way they could. In addition to the chewing stick, medieval people also used other unconventional tools, such as rags or cloths, to clean their teeth. Some might even rub the teeth with salt or ash to help scrub away the buildup from food and drink. The use of salt was particularly common because it was readily available and thought to have cleansing properties. Imagine, as you sit quietly in the tavern, a commoner dipping a small cloth in salt and rubbing it against their teeth, their efforts offering them a semblance of cleanliness amidst the harshness of their environment. But despite these rudimentary efforts, medieval dental care was far from effective. Toothaches were common, and the decay that set in from years of poor hygiene led to painful infections and tooth loss. In fact, many medieval people had to have their teeth pulled out, when they became infected or decayed. Without the benefit of modern dentistry, the only option for most people was extraction, often done without any sort of anesthesia. You can almost hear the sharp pain of the procedure, the screech of a wooden chair, and the distant sound of the town's bells as another person suffered from the harsh realities of medieval health. Interestingly, historians still debate whether medieval people were more prone to dental decay due to their diet or because of their lack of proper hygiene tools. Some suggest that the medieval diet, which was high in bread and low in fresh produce, contributed to the decay, while others argue that the absence of good dental care played a larger role. Regardless of the cause, the result was the same. Many people had to live with painful teeth, decayed gums, and the occasional loss of a tooth or two. In fact, dental hygiene was such a neglected issue that some researchers have pointed to tooth loss as a marker of age in medieval skeletons, showing just how little attention people paid to their oral health. The thought of this makes you more aware of your own comfort. Being able to brush your teeth in the morning, use toothpaste, and visit the dentist if needed. It's a luxury that medieval folk could hardly have imagined. Yet they found ways to cope with the reality of their world, all while living with the constant knowledge that their bodies were imperfect and fragile. Hygiene, as we know it, was far from a priority, but it was a necessity in the battle for survival in the unforgiving medieval world. As you continue your walk through the tavern, the dim candlelight flickering around you creates an almost surreal atmosphere, adding weight to your thoughts about the medieval world and how different hygiene was from what we know today. In this lively place, where gossip and news circulate like the wine, you can't help but notice that the concept of cleanliness in this era wasn't just about the body, but the spaces people inhabited as well. The tavern, for example, was far from the cozy, well-kept establishment you'd expect in modern times. The floors were often covered in straw, dirt, and, in some cases, mud. The air itself was thick with the mingling scents of food, drink, sweat, and, of course, the lingering odor of animal dung. Since many taverns housed animals in the same space, horses, cows, and even pigs were sometimes kept in the same building where people gathered to eat, drink, and socialize. You can almost hear the low snorting of animals and the creaking of old wooden beams as you look around the room. The notion of hygiene in these settings was far more relaxed, and cleanliness, as we understand it today, was not a priority. The tavern's kitchen, often nothing more than a small open fire in the corner, was also a place where hygiene was neglected. Cooking utensils, pots, and pans were frequently shared among people without being properly washed between uses. The same ladle that stirred the soup might also be used to serve drinks. The concept of washing one's hands before eating wasn't a widespread practice in medieval times, and the use of soap was rare. In fact, soap as we know it was not commonly used until later in history. And when it was used, it was often made from ash and animal fat, which left behind an unpleasant residue. The people of the time were far more accustomed to the smell of earth, animals, and the outdoors than the sterile, fragrance-free environments we strive for today. In addition to the poor hygiene of living spaces, the absence of personal hygiene practices became especially apparent when it came to bathing. Water, while necessary for survival, was rarely used for bathing in medieval times. Public baths, once popular in earlier centuries, had fallen out of favor by this time, mainly due to concerns over the spread of disease. You can imagine people gathering in small to dark chambers by the fire, their skin grimy from sweat, dust, and the day's toil, knowing that their next chance for a bath would be months away, if at all. Historians debate whether the medieval avoidance of bathing was solely due to fear of disease, or if it was tied to deeper cultural and religious beliefs. Some suggest that medieval people viewed bathing as a form of indulgence, a luxury that could lead to excessive vanity. It was also believed that the open pores from bathing could allow disease to enter the body, making it more dangerous than beneficial. This belief, however, didn't stop the wealthier class from indulging in occasional bathing, especially in private tubs or chambers, where the water was brought to them in buckets. While the aristocracy may have had better access to personal cleanliness, even their hygiene routines were primitive by today's standards. Instead of soap, they might have used scented oils to freshen up, and they often relied on perfumes made from flowers, herbs, and spices to mask unpleasant odors. Their clothes were frequently washed, but they didn't have the same laundry facilities we do today, relying instead on washing clothes in streams or sending them to professionals who would clean and repair them. You might think that all this would lead to a world filled with disease and discomfort, and in many ways, it did. The medieval world saw frequent outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other diseases, many of which could have been prevented by better hygiene practices. But the people who lived through it didn't know that a lack of cleanliness contributed to these illnesses. They simply accepted it as a part of life, dealing with the harsh realities of their world as best as they could. Their homes, their taverns, and their bodies were all bound by the same fundamental rules: survival and endurance, no matter how uncomfortable or dirty it might get. Despite the grim reality of hygiene in medieval times, there was a strange sense of resilience. People lived in an environment where cleanliness was secondary to survival, and yet they carried on with their lives, forging connections in taverns, working the land, and raising families. The lack of modern hygiene didn't stop them from building relationships or finding joy in their work and social gatherings. It was a world of contradictions, where dirt and disease mingled with laughter and social bonding, creating a complex and layered experience of daily life. As you continue through the dimly lit tavern, the sounds of laughter and conversation rise and fall in favos, the flickering light casting shadows across the walls. You are aware, though, that it's not just the people in the tavern that make it feel alive. It's also the scent, the humidity in the air, and the dense atmosphere that envelops you. The same air, however, is filled with a mixture of smoke, stale beer, and the earthy aroma of sweat. Quite the contrast to the modern comforts we might associate with a night out. The people around you seem used to this discomfort, their lives shaped by the harsh realities of their time. But it's not just the tavern-goers who are affected by this lack of cleanliness. It spreads throughout the rest of their world as well. Take, for example, the issue of personal hygiene in medieval homes. As you walk through the streets, you can imagine that the homes, often made of wattle and daub or simple stone, don't exactly smell like a bouquet of roses. The floors are dirt, covered with straw to absorb some of the filth and odor. In larger homes or castles, tapestries may hang on the walls to help block the chill. But they also trap the smells of cooking, people, and animals. Without the luxury of modern ventilation, homes were often stuffy, and unpleasant smells permeated every corner. In homes where animals were kept indoors, whether for warmth or as part of daily life, there was a constant battle against dirt and decay. These smells were part of the fabric of medieval existence. There was little to no escape from the smell of the earth. The barn, and the body. For the wealthier classes, this meant servants or staff would frequently have to clean, sweep, and tend to the hearth. But even their spaces weren't immune from the dirt. The noble class, while having access to slightly better conditions, still faced limited hygiene, with regular bathing being more of a rare treat than a common habit. Even in castles, where it was possible to heat water, baths were not often a routine part of life. They were special occasions, and often, a bath might involve a little more than a soak in a large wooden tub, perhaps once every few weeks. As you wander through this medieval town, the poor hygiene in homes and even taverns becomes apparent. The basic understanding of how cleanliness relates to health simply wasn't there. But the people still found ways to cope, to make do. Instead of regularly washing themselves or their clothes, medieval people would rely on methods like brushing their teeth with rough, abrasive powders, or simply rubbing themselves down with a damp cloth. This was not the level of hygiene that we now know is essential. But in a world without modern understanding, these were their attempts at maintaining some semblance of cleanliness. While the wealthy might have had access to scented oils, perfumes, and occasional baths, the lower classes didn't have such luxuries. Instead, they made do with simple solutions like herbal infusions and the occasional sprinkling of fragrant herbs to ward off the worst of the smells. There were no deodorants, no perfumes from department stores, just local plants and homemade concoctions. For the common folk, the smell of the streets, the sweat of their labor, and the grime from the day's work were simply facts of life. Even their clothing, which was often made of wool, would begin to stiffen and stink from use, as washing clothing was a luxury many couldn't afford. You might even imagine the raw feel of scratchy woolen tunics rubbing against their skin, absorbing the sweat of long days spent in the fields or workshops. This environment led to a very different relationship with the body. In a society where cleanliness wasn't so easily attainable, people became less sensitive to body odors, which were just part of daily life. However, despite the lack of access to regular washing, there was still a certain respect for the body, particularly when it came to the rituals of marriage and courtship. While hygiene might not have been a priority, appearances still mattered, and a person's ability to present themselves as tidy and well-kept was a reflection of their status. Historians argue whether medieval society viewed cleanliness as a moral failing, or whether it was simply a matter of practicality, after all. People had other concerns. Some suggest that medieval life, with its constant struggles for survival, simply didn't have the luxury of focusing on hygiene, while others argue that the avoidance of cleanliness, particularly bathing, was rooted in religious beliefs about the body and sin. People believed that excessive indulgence, including the act of bathing, might open the body to temptation and sin. It was a way of avoiding excessive pleasures, with the belief that modesty and restraint were more virtuous. Despite all this, the more you wander the streets of medieval towns, the more you realize that cleanliness, while overlooked, was never entirely absent. It was simply dealt with in the ways that people knew best. While we may cringe at the idea of living in such conditions, there was something undeniably resilient about how these people navigated their world. Despite the dirt, the sweat, and the lack of modern conveniences, they survived and thrived in their own way. As you step deeper into the heart of the medieval town, the reality of everyday life begins to unfold around you. The streets, narrow and winding, are filled with the hustle and bustle of the town's inhabitants, peasants, tradesmen, and the occasional nobleman or knight passing through. The sound of wooden carts rolling over cobblestone streets is almost deafening, mixed with the calls of street vendors peddling their wares. The scent of fresh bread from the baker's shop mixes with the smell of raw meat from the butcher's stall, and the air is thick with the sounds of a community at work. But it's the sights, smells, and sounds of the medieval town that are most telling of the general attitudes toward hygiene during this time. You notice the women standing outside their homes, hands busy with domestic chores. Some are grinding grain in wooden mortars, others are hanging laundry on makeshift lines, which seem to sway in the breeze like flags of modesty. Yet, despite the daily labor, there is no sign of the luxurious cleanliness we associate with modern living. In fact, the idea of cleanliness and sanitation has yet to take hold in the medieval mind in the way we understand it today. The people of this era believed in the importance of bodily function, but cleanliness, in the modern sense, was not the same. Water, especially clean water, was a valuable resource that was far more precious for drinking and cooking than for bathing. The houses, even the more modest ones, are filled with the remnants of this struggle for cleanliness. You can almost feel the weight of the hearth smoke that clings to the walls, with soot-streaked beams holding the roof up above. There are no modern air fresheners or deodorants to mask the reality of the medieval environment. The floors of most homes, made of packed dirt or stone, were rarely swept clean. And the same can be said for the streets outside. In fact, medieval streets were often used as waste disposal areas, where refuse was thrown out of windows and left to rot in the open. The term sewer had yet to be fully realized. There were no systems in place to direct waste away from living spaces. Most waste ended up in the open, and the streets could be filled with a variety of unpleasant smells, especially during the hotter months. In addition to this, medieval people often had a different concept of what was considered clean and dirty. Bathing, as we would know it today, wasn't a regular practice. The idea of public baths did exist, but they were rare, and even the wealthier classes only took part in them sparingly. In most cases, baths were seen as a necessary evil, something done out of obligation or once in a while to stave off the worst of bodily odors. Personal hygiene wasn't about regular washing, but about managing smells and sweat through methods like rubbing yourself down with a damp cloth. Or, for some, using perfumes made from local herbs. They also used a lot of alcohol and vinegar to mask unpleasant scents, which, considering how often the air was thick with smoke and animal manure, was likely the only viable option at the time. You can almost hear the arguments between the more pragmatic townsfolk and the religious authorities, who often preached restraint when it came to indulgences like bathing. These public discussions about hygiene reveal a sharp divide between what was seen as essential for survival and what was seen as an unnecessary luxury. Some historians still argue about whether this reluctance to bathe regularly was due to religious asceticism, where modesty and avoiding indulgence were prioritized, or whether it was simply a reflection of the times, where water was too precious to waste on bathing. Either way, it's clear that the medieval world lived in a much dirtier and more physically demanding environment than we do today. As you continue through the town, you pass by a street that leads to a communal well. The well is one of the few sources of fresh water, and you notice several people gathered around, drawing water for their daily use. You can see the wear and tear on the stonework, the handles worn smooth by generations of hands, as the locals pull up their daily supply. But despite the importance of this water, it's clear that it wasn't just used for drinking. The well water was used for everything: washing dishes, cooking, even cleaning clothes. And the people who lived in these towns didn't have the luxury of running water. They relied on communal resources to get by. And this reliance meant that the water they used was often contaminated with a variety of bacteria and pollutants. The general lack of sanitary practices and the absence of hygiene laws meant that disease was a constant threat to these medieval communities. Historians still debate whether the medieval obsession with cleanliness was rooted in the survival instinct of the population, or if it had more to do with social class and politics. Some argue that people of the lower classes had little choice but to live in unsanitary conditions, while the wealthier classes had the means to maintain somewhat cleaner homes. Despite the lack of regular washing practices, others believe that there was a social hierarchy to cleanliness itself, where the concept of cleanliness was reserved for those who had the time and resources to care for themselves. Either way, the medieval world's attitudes toward hygiene were quite different from our own. And despite the numerous challenges, the people of this time found ways to cope with the limitations of their environment. As you wander deeper into the medieval town, a strange sense of nostalgia for a time you never lived in begins to settle over you. It's as though you're moving through a world where the ticking of the clock slows down, where everything seems a bit more rough-edged, a bit more visceral. The streets are still filled with a mixture of smells: the earthiness of freshly turned soil, the stench of livestock, and the pungent tang of meat cooking over open flames. As the night stretches on, the flickering torchlight casts elongated shadows along the cobblestones, making the buildings loom like silent witnesses to the passage of time. Yet amidst this primitive scene, you come across a peculiar sight, an area of the town that seems slightly more refined, with a slightly more distinct, organized atmosphere. Here, in the shadow of the looming stone walls, you spot a group of women standing in line for what seems to be the public bathhouse. This is one of the few places in the medieval town where bathing was somewhat common, a strange and intriguing glimpse into the world of hygiene during the Middle Ages. But these were not the elaborate baths you might imagine from the ancient Roman world. Instead, the bathhouse was a humble structure, basic, functional, and frequented mostly by women. The process of bathing here was far from the luxury we associate with modern spas. The bathhouse itself is an open-air structure, surrounded by a small stone wall. A single large steaming pool sits at its center, a simple, natural source of warmth that comes from the nearby hot springs. The water, though warm, is murky, tinged with the scent of herbs and oils added by those who used it. You can hear the sound of women chatting softly as they step into the water, their bodies cloaked in simple linen garments, the weight of the day's dirt slowly being washed away with each passing moment. The experience is not about relaxation or indulgence, but rather about a necessary and regular act of cleanliness. Here, the medieval bathhouse is a symbol of survival and practicality, an essential part of maintaining some semblance of personal hygiene in a world where cleanliness was not a priority. Despite its utilitarian function, there's an odd sense of dignity in the way the women carry themselves as they step into the bath, standing with heads held high, despite the very visible layers of grime that have accumulated on their skin. They are, after all, doing their best within a system that doesn't prioritize them. And yet, in their quiet, communal rituals, there is a sense of solidarity, a quiet sisterhood built on the shared experience of living within a world where hygiene is a luxury few can afford. The water here isn't crystal clear. It's tinged with oil, herbs, and the sweat of those who came before them. Yet, For these women, it's a small victory, a tiny oasis in an otherwise unforgiving world. Historians still argue whether public bathhouses, though rare, were more of a necessity or a luxury in medieval times, while some point out that the bathhouses were essential to maintaining the health of a population that lacked modern plumbing. Others believe that their use was an anomaly, something that came and went, depending on the local culture and the availability of resources. Some argue that the bathhouse was a key part of urban life, especially in larger cities where public sanitation was less of a concern. However, others suggest that the irregularity of their use and the lack of widespread access to hot water meant that the medieval people were far from as hygienic as their Roman predecessors. The debate over the role of the bathhouse continues, with some scholars even suggesting that the bathing practices of the time were more about public health maintenance than actual cleanliness. The contrast between the public bathhouses and the general living conditions outside is stark. The walls of the bathhouse are stark and rough-hewn, the floors uneven, and the air thick with the scent of boiling water and herbs. There is no sense of comfort here, no cushioned lounge chairs or aromatic oils. It's a place for the most basic, rudimentary form of hygiene, a place where one's body is washed. Not with the expectation of luxury, but as a necessity of survival in a harsh world. Yet, amidst this starkness, the bathhouse remains a quiet refuge, a place where the soul is given a brief respite from the burdens of medieval life, even if it's only for a short while. Moving away from the bathhouse, you continue your journey through the town, and it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was anything but universal. Though some people had access to the bathhouses, most would not. Instead, the majority of the population lived without regular bathing, relying instead on other means to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. Most people bathed only when absolutely necessary, relying on a simple cloth to wipe away sweat and grime when needed. Water was simply too precious, too hard to come by, to be used for personal cleanliness in the same way we think of it today. Historians continue to debate the extent to which personal hygiene was important to medieval people. Some argue that medieval society placed less emphasis on personal cleanliness than on surviving day-to-day life. Others suggest that people simply had a different attitude toward dirt and disease, living in a world where cleanliness wasn't a marker of social class or health in the way it is today. One thing is clear. The medieval world was far from hygienic by modern standards. Bathing was not a daily ritual, nor was it available to all. And even the most basic hygienic practices we take for granted today were not universally practiced in the Middle Ages. Nonetheless, in the midst of this grimy reality, the people of medieval Europe did their best to live, survive, and navigate a world that was often dirty, difficult, and unpredictable. As you continue your journey through the medieval town, you notice how deeply the concepts of hygiene and cleanliness were tied to social status. The wealthier classes had access to far more sophisticated means of personal care, largely because they could afford it. You can almost picture the noblewoman of the town, cloaked in fine silks, surrounded by a cloud of perfume, entering her private chamber to prepare for yet another formal gathering. Unlike the peasants, whose access to water and soap was severely limited, the upper classes would have at least a modicum of luxury to rely on. One of the privileges of the wealthier class was access to private bathhouses, a luxury unavailable to the majority of people. These bathhouses were often constructed in the mansions of the nobles, where personal attendants would prepare the baths for the lady or lord of the house. The water would be heated, often with the use of large iron cauldrons, and infused with various herbs and oils that could make the experience feel slightly more decadent, even if the water itself was still far from clean by modern standards. For these nobles, bathing was often less about hygiene and more about self-indulgence or social status. In a way, their ability to indulge in regular bathing was another means by which they could flaunt their wealth and power. The contrast between the nobles' bathhouses and the rudimentary public ones available to the lower classes is stark, where the wealthy would enjoy warm, fragrant baths in private. The rest of society made do with far more basic means of cleaning themselves. Public bathhouses, often overcrowded and uncomfortable, were a far cry from the opulence that the rich could afford. But even so, for the nobility, their baths weren't only about cleanliness. They were part of their social rituals, their acts of leisure. The notion of hygiene in the medieval upper class was much less about necessity than it was about appearances and status. As you make your way through the streets, you also begin to notice the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval cities. Streets were often unpaved and filled with muck, especially after a rainy day. There were no sewers in these towns, and waste had nowhere to go but the streets. The stench of refuse, animal dung, and human waste would have been pervasive in many areas. It wasn't unusual for people to toss their chamber pots, or worse, waste from the night directly into the street. In some places, waste even found its way into rivers and wells, contaminating the water supply and contributing to outbreaks of disease. The lack of proper sanitation made medieval cities breeding grounds for illness. Historians still argue about the extent to which sanitation, or the lack thereof, contributed to the spread of disease during the Middle Ages. Some scholars argue that the absence of clean water, combined with inadequate waste management systems, created the perfect conditions for the spread of disease, especially in urban areas. Others suggest that medieval people were simply accustomed to the filth. And while diseases were rampant, they didn't understand the link between hygiene and illness the way we do today. Regardless, it's clear that sanitation in medieval towns was rudimentary at best, and its lack undoubtedly had a devastating impact on the health of the population. But the upper classes, while still living in cities filled with filth, had their own ways of ensuring cleanliness. For example, they employed attendants whose job it was to help with personal hygiene, from combing hair to applying perfumes to mask the odor of body sweat. Bathing was still a luxury for them, and while they might not have been concerned with germs or bacteria, they did care about the way they smelled, about presenting themselves well to others. Hygiene in the upper class was as much about maintaining an appearance of cleanliness as it was about actual health. It's also important to note that, despite their relative luxury, nobles weren't immune to the challenges of medieval hygiene. Their skin, though cared for by attendants, was still subject to the same dirt and grime that plagued everyone else. If they could afford better water and more elaborate cleaning rituals, they still dealt with the lack of effective medicine and clean environments. Rashes, infections, and unpleasant odors were still part of the medieval experience for the rich, even if they had the means to try and control them. In this world, it wasn't just the lower classes who were left to fend for themselves in an environment of unsanitary conditions. Even the upper echelons of society faced their own limitations when it came to hygiene. While they could afford more luxuries and comforts, they still lacked the knowledge or resources to truly combat the spread of disease. In many ways, the divide between the wealthy and the poor in medieval times wasn't so much about access to hygiene as it was about appearances and the rituals surrounding cleanliness. While the nobles could afford the illusion of purity, the rest of society had to make do with far less. Historians still debate the degree to which class differences influenced the way hygiene was practiced. Some argue that it was a matter of resources, while others believe it had more to do with the social pressures surrounding cleanliness. Was it simply a matter of wealth and access to better resources? Or were the medieval social classes so separated that each group had its own distinctly different standards of hygiene? The question is difficult to answer, but one thing is clear. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was deeply tied to one's social standing. And while the rich could afford to indulge in personal care, the poor often had no choice but to make do with what little they had. As you wander deeper into the medieval town, you begin to notice how personal hygiene, though rudimentary, was tied to the very identity of the people around you. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about showing respect for oneself and one's community. The poor might not have had access to baths or fine soaps, but they had their own ways of maintaining dignity. You can almost imagine a peasant woman, hands rough from working the land, taking a moment to comb her hair before heading into the marketplace. While her clothing might be simple and her face weathered from the elements, her effort to appear presentable was an important part of her social standing. Even the poorest townspeople often carried a few small tools with them to help maintain personal hygiene. A comb, a bit of cloth to wipe away sweat, perhaps a small flask of scented water to mask the odors that would have naturally arisen from working long hours in harsh conditions. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way of showing that they valued themselves, even if society didn't offer them much in return. For many, hygiene was less about health and more about self-respect and the image they presented to the world. You can feel the pulse of the town around you, the slow rhythm of medieval life, where hygiene wasn't simply a personal concern, it was a social one. How you smelled, how your clothes looked, how clean your face appeared. All of this was a reflection of your place in the world. For the lower classes, who didn't have the luxury of privacy or space, this might have meant a quick wash at the nearest well or a splash of water to freshen up before facing the outside world. For the rich, it meant regular bathing, perfumes, and elaborate clothing, symbols of their elevated status. But the town you're in doesn't just have peasants and nobles. It's a mixture of all sorts of people, from merchants to craftsmen to wandering scholars. As you make your way through the streets, you come upon a bustling marketplace where the smells of fresh bread, roasting meat, and ale mingle with the scents of the people. It's easy to see how hygiene was intertwined with economics. For the lower classes, cleanliness was secondary to survival, and the resources to bathe or wash thoroughly just weren't available. For those who could afford it, however, hygiene was an essential part of their identity, a mark of distinction that set them apart from the masses. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more concerned with outward appearance than with true cleanliness. Some scholars suggest that the medieval obsession with appearances, particularly in the upper classes, was more about social control than personal hygiene. Was it really about keeping clean? Or was it about reinforcing social hierarchies through outward markers of wealth and status? Others argue that hygiene was just as important to medieval people as it is today. But they had fewer resources and less understanding of the science behind cleanliness. Either way, what's clear is that hygiene in the Middle Ages was an important marker of social identity. While you take in the busy market, it's hard not to notice how some people in the crowd appear a little less than clean. The merchants, their clothes soiled from long hours of work, have likely had little time to freshen up, just as the peasants are likely suffering the same fate. But no one speaks of it. They all understand that cleanliness is something that only the wealthiest can afford to truly enjoy. And even then, it's not perfect. The wealthier folk might be well dressed, but they're still subject to the same limited understanding of hygiene as everyone else. They just have more means of masking the problem. As you leave the marketplace, you make your way down a narrow alley where you can hear the sounds of a blacksmith at work. The rhythmic pounding of his hammer echoes against the stone walls. A reminder that for the majority of medieval people, hygiene was a secondary concern compared to the work needed to sustain themselves. Water was precious, and so was time. Washing could be a luxury, especially for those who didn't have easy access to a stream, or well, for these individuals, daily life was more about meeting basic needs, food, shelter, and survival, than about cleanliness. Historians continue to debate how much of medieval hygiene was influenced by practical considerations versus cultural beliefs. Did the widespread lack of proper sanitation reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of germs and bacteria? Or was it a product of limited resources? While the wealthier classes could indulge in perfumes, fresh linen, and daily bathing, the rest of the population was left to their own devices. The question remains, did medieval people truly care about hygiene, or was it simply a matter of survival? With hygiene as a distant afterthought, one thing is certain. The role of hygiene in medieval life was vastly different than it is today. Even though medieval people didn't have the advanced understanding we do now, they still had their own ways of managing cleanliness and preserving personal dignity, whether it was a quick splash of water from the nearest well, the scent of herbs used to mask the odor, or the pride in a well-maintained appearance. Medieval people understood that hygiene, like everything else, was an essential part of their place in society. As you continue your walk through the medieval town, you begin to notice how the rhythms of daily life intertwine with the concept of cleanliness. People are moving about, working hard, but there's an underlying sense of both struggle and community in the way they go about their tasks. It's a world without the luxury of modern sanitation systems, where fresh water is a precious commodity, and bathing is often a rare treat. For most, hygiene was an arduous and somewhat secondary concern to daily survival. You pass by a group of women, washing clothes at a nearby riverbank. Their hands are raw and red from the cold, their faces etched with the hard work of endless chores. The water is frigid, but there's no choice. This is how it's done. The women bend over the water, scrubbing at fabric, soaking and rinsing, their bodies wrapped in simple, faded linen. Though their work is grueling, there's a certain grace in their movements. Even in this grimy task, they're still carrying out an essential part of life, keeping the clothes clean, preserving their dignity, and contributing to the family's survival. The water they work with, however, is no pristine stream. It's murky, tinged with the earth's residue, the same water used by animals to drink from. It's hard to imagine just how limited their access to clean water really is. Yet they've learned to make do. You can almost hear their murmurs as they work, sharing quiet stories, discussing matters of the household, all the while making the best of their situation. It's a humbling scene, and as you stand there, you realize how much of hygiene in this world is wrapped up in practicality, not just cleanliness. The work might not be glamorous, but it's necessary. Across the town, there's another scene unfolding. In a small, dimly lit apothecary shop, a man is inspecting a bowl of herbs, his brow furrowed in concentration. He's concocting a mixture, perhaps an herbal remedy or something to help with a skin condition. Herbal remedies like this were often the go-to solution for those who couldn't afford the luxury of proper hygiene. In the absence of sophisticated cleaning products, medieval people relied on what nature provided, whether it was herbs, oils, or even animal fats. They used whatever they could find to help mask the effects of poor hygiene or prevent illness. It's fascinating to think about how much of medieval hygiene was wrapped up in these remedies, often passed down through generations. The apothecary's shop smells faintly of lavender, rosemary, and something more pungent, perhaps a bit of vinegar or alcohol, to cleanse and disinfect. The herbs are crushed and mixed in a mortar, their colors vibrant against the stone backdrop of the shop. This is where the medical world meets the personal, where cleanliness was as much about maintaining health as it was about looking presentable. As you leave the apothecary's shop and venture into the market square, you notice a vendor selling something most would have found surprising: perfumes. In a world where bathing was a rare luxury, the use of perfume became one of the main tools for masking body odor. These perfumes, however, were quite different from the ones we know today, made from herbs, flowers, and oils. They were thick, potent, and often used liberally by those who could afford them. The market square is filled with the heavy scent of lavender, rosewater, and other flowery fragrances. The upper class often relied on these perfumes to cover up the lack of cleanliness, and for some, it became an essential part of their identity. The idea of cleanliness wasn't just confined to the body. It extended to one's clothes and even their living space. You think about the humble homes you've seen earlier, with their dirt floors and simple furnishings. There were no cleaning services, no modern detergents or disinfectants. Instead, people would sweep the floors with bundles of twigs, using whatever was available to them. Their homes were often dark, with small windows that let in only the faintest light. The only source of warmth and light was the fire in the hearth, and as the fire crackled, it would fill the room with warmth, smoke, and the scent of burning wood. Historians often argue whether medieval hygiene was shaped more by practical necessity or by social norms. On one hand, the lack of resources meant that personal hygiene was often neglected in favor of survival. On the other hand, societal expectations and religious pressures made it clear that appearance mattered. Medieval people understood the importance of cleanliness in maintaining a good reputation and avoiding the judgment of others. But they also had to make do with limited resources. The balance between personal hygiene and social expectations was constantly at play, and the result was a complicated, sometimes contradictory system of cleanliness. As you walk back through the town, you can almost sense the layers of this medieval world: the dirt, the smells, the hard work, and the brief moments of respite that people found in the small comforts of life. Personal hygiene wasn't just about keeping clean. It was about survival, status, and community. It was something that affected everyone, from the poorest peasants to the wealthiest lords. And though the medieval world didn't have the same understanding of hygiene that we do today, they still knew how to make the most of what they had. The rhythm of life was defined by the struggle to maintain cleanliness and health, even in the most challenging of circumstances. As the evening wears on, the shadows stretch long across the town, and you continue your walk through the medieval streets. The sounds of the busy day are starting to fade, replaced by the occasional creak of carts and the distant chatter of a few late-night revelers still out in the marketplace. There's a sharp chill in the air as the temperatures drop, and you feel the weight of the night's quiet settling in. You wander past a public latrine, an unassuming structure, yet essential to medieval life. Latrines were a critical part of hygiene in this time, but they were rudimentary, often little more than a bench with a hole in it. The waste would fall into a pit beneath, sometimes connected to the town's sewer system. But more often than not, the waste would simply collect, creating a very real health hazard. Despite their lack of privacy or cleanliness, these latrines were an inevitable part of daily life. The smell that drifts from the building is not exactly pleasant, and it's a stark reminder that sanitation in the medieval period was a far cry from the systems we use today. It's easy to imagine how this would have been a daily part of life for people. Privacy didn't really exist in the way we think of it, and public latrines were often shared by everyone. The idea of personal space, especially when it came to bodily functions, was vastly different in the medieval world. The concept of hygiene extended only so far as practicality allowed, though the need to maintain some form of cleanliness in such public places was recognized. It often fell short. Moving past the latrine, you arrive at a small courtyard where a group of men are gathered, sharpening tools and chatting in low voices. The sound of the whetstone against iron fills the air, a rhythmic grinding that blends with the hum of voices. These men are blacksmiths, and their work is essential to keeping the town running smoothly. But they're also one of the few trades where cleanliness, in the modern sense, isn't a concern. Their hands are covered in soot and grease, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Yet, despite the filth of their work, they seem content. It's a different world than the one inside the more polished homes, one where function takes priority over form, and the dirt of the job is worn like a badge of honor. But even within the harshness of their craft, there are hints of hygiene. At the end of the day, many blacksmiths would wash their hands with water, perhaps using a basic form of soap made from animal fat and ashes. It wasn't much, but it was the best they could do given the lack of access to the kind of hygiene products we take for granted today. Still, the very idea of cleanliness, as we understand it, wasn't even part of their daily routine. The act of washing hands wasn't tied to disease prevention as it is now, but rather a simple effort to remove dirt and grime from the skin. As you walk further, you pass a small chapel. It's tucked away, quiet compared to the bustling of the town center. This is where religion intersects with hygiene in an interesting way. Medieval Christianity played a huge role in shaping the society's views on cleanliness, particularly when it came to issues like bathing. The church, with its strict moral codes, often frowned upon personal grooming habits, particularly when it came to the body. Bathing was frequently seen as indulgent or sinful, and there were even periods when public baths were shut down because they were thought to promote immoral behavior. Yet, despite this, religion also dictated certain cleanliness rituals, such as the washing of hands before meals or the use of holy water for purification. The paradox of medieval hygiene lies in these contradictions. On the one hand, personal cleanliness was often discouraged. But on the other hand, there was a deep spiritual importance attached to the idea of purification, both physically and morally. This tension shaped the way people navigated hygiene practices. People would wash their hands and faces before prayers, not necessarily to cleanse themselves of dirt, but to prepare their bodies for a higher purpose. Historians still debate whether this moral attitude toward cleanliness was unique to Christianity or whether it reflected broader societal concerns about body and spirit in the medieval period. Some argue that Christianity's views were specifically shaped by the religious and cultural context, while others suggest that these concerns were widespread throughout the ancient world. Whatever the case, the combination of religious belief and practical necessity created a complex landscape when it came to personal hygiene during the Middle Ages. You begin to notice the patterns in the town. Cleanliness, or the lack thereof, was tied to social class and occupation. Those in the higher echelons of society, such as nobles and clergy, were more likely to be seen with a fresh appearance, their clothes cleaner and more finely made. On the other hand, the lower classes, laborers, peasants, and craftsmen, had little time or access to the resources that would allow them to maintain a tidy appearance. Hygiene was a luxury for the few, not the many. Even so, the people of the town managed to carry on, finding ways to stay as clean as possible under the circumstances. As the night deepens, you notice the warmth of the hearth drawing you back in, the fire casting a soft glow against the walls of the homes and shops. The town may be rough around the edges, but there's a sense of community here. The people may not have had the same luxuries we do today, but they knew how to survive. They understood that even in the absence of modern hygiene standards, survival was more about making do with what they had and finding comfort in their shared struggles. The rhythms of their lives may seem primitive compared to ours, but in their world, it was enough. As the moon rises higher in the sky, you make your way back to the tavern, your steps a bit heavier as the weight of the day settles in. The light from the hearths still flickers through the windows, casting long batures warm shadows that stretch across the cobblestones. As you push the door open, a wave of warmth, smoke, and ale hits you, reminding you of the intimacy of this place. It's a world of its own, rough, raw, and unapologetically alive. Inside, the fire crackles and pops, casting its glow over the room, filled with the mingling scents of roasted meat, spilled beer, and a heavy layer of smoke from the hearth. You're greeted by the sounds of laughter, arguing, and the clinking of mugs. The tavern is the heart of social life for many of these townsfolk. It's a place where people come to forget the harshness of their lives, even if just for a little while, and where conversation, often over a few too many drinks, flows freely. As you look around, you can see that most people are wearing the same clothes they wore during the day, cloaks and woolen tunics, patched and worn from hard work. Their hair is tousled, some have facial stubble, others have dirt under their nails. Hygiene isn't a priority here. Survival and connection are. Most people make do with a quick wash when they can, though bathing, as we know it, is rare. The medieval period wasn't known for its cleanliness, after all. Clean water was a precious commodity. But in the tavern, there's a sense of shared humanity, a camaraderie that transcends the grime of everyday life. The concept of hygiene in the medieval world wasn't about luxury or self-care as we know it. It was more about necessity, how to keep clean enough to survive. In the homes of the poor, there were no lavish baths, no scented soaps, no luxuries like we have today. People were used to living with dirt, sweat, and soot. In fact, many peasants didn't bathe regularly, as the practice was associated with indulgence and excess. Bathhouses, if they existed, were communal and often unsanitary, making the idea of bathing itself somewhat unattractive. People were more likely to wash their hands and face quickly with water, maybe use a damp cloth, and call it a day. But still, there were rituals. While private bathing was rare, certain forms of cleanliness were important. Religious rituals, for example, demanded that the faithful wash their hands before meals, a practice that was tied not to the removal of dirt, but to the idea of spiritual purity. As you sit in the tavern, you can almost imagine how these customs carried through into daily life. There was the constant pressure to maintain some level of propriety, to be presentable enough to stand before God or your community, but not necessarily enough to prevent the spread of disease or ensure proper hygiene. And while the nobility had access to finer accommodations, some with private chambers for bathing and a greater focus on personal hygiene, this was far from the case for most of the population. The social divide in hygiene practices was stark. The wealthy could afford luxuries like scented oils, perfumes, and bathing attendants. They might bathe in wooden tubs filled with hot water, followed by a careful application of oils to preserve their skin's softness. For the common folk, though, bathing was either too expensive or too complicated. They often turned to the alternatives: sweat, grime, and the occasional washing with soap made from animal fat and ashes. Yet, even among the lower classes, there was an effort to maintain personal cleanliness where it mattered most. On the face, hands, and in public settings, people would try to stay as presentable as possible, but it was a losing battle. The lack of proper sanitation systems, coupled with limited access to fresh water, meant that hygiene was more about survival than comfort. And, while the medieval period might not have been known for cleanliness in the way we understand it today, there were pockets of understanding. Places where people still tried their best to stay as clean as circumstances allowed. Historians still debate how much medieval people understood the importance of hygiene in preventing illness. Some argue that they were aware of the connection between filth and disease, though it wasn't fully understood in the modern sense. Others suggest that medieval people saw hygiene practices more as social rituals rather than necessities for health. The true understanding of sanitation and its role in public health would not come until much later in history. In the quiet moments of the tavern, you begin to understand that, for all the laughter and noise, there's a subtle layer of tension beneath the surface. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was never truly discussed, yet it was always present in the air. The grime of life was something people had to live with, and it permeated everything from the clothes they wore to the food they ate. But in the dim light of the tavern, with ale in hand and laughter in the air, it didn't matter as much. The world outside, with all its challenges, seemed far away. For these few hours, the town's residents could escape it all, at least until morning arrived, and they returned to their lives of toil and struggle. As you sit back in your seat, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the buzz of the tavern, you realize that medieval life wasn't so different from ours in many ways. There were different struggles, certainly, but in the end, people were just trying to survive, to live in a world where hygiene was an afterthought at best. It's a reminder that, despite the advancements of modern life, many of the struggles faced by those who lived in the past still echo today.